The fireworks cracked open the Seattle sky, spilling color over the water. From my apartment window, I watched the city count down to midnight, while my own glass of cheap champagne sat untouched on the coffee table. Down on the TV screen, my family glowed in designer clothes and studio lighting. The Bennett New Year's Eve gala broadcast lived for the third year in a row. My father Richard lifted his glass, his smile too perfect. To our shining star, Lauren Bennett, the face of Seattle sunrise. The crowd cheered. My mother Elaine pressed a hand over his arm, laughing delicately. Then he said it, the line that burned straight through me. No one would even notice if Clara didn't show up. The audience laughed. My sister beamed. And that was the moment I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to the city's celebration echo through the walls. Then 3 sharp knocks on the door. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe it was one of my friends or a neighbor with a noise complaint. But when I opened it, a tall man in a dark coat stood there, the smell of rain clinging to him. He looked out of place, like he belonged somewhere brighter. "Clara Bennett?" he asked, voice low, careful. I nodded, clutching the doorframe. "I'm Ethan Cole. I know it's late, but I heard your work." My first instinct was disbelief. Hardly anyone had heard my work. My sound projects lived on a forgotten corner of the internet. Tiny collections of field recordings, rainstorm city hums, half-formed songs. "I don't understand," I said. He smiled, slightly, water dripping from his hair. "I was looking for someone who listens differently. Your soundscapes, they're raw, real. You turn silence into emotion." He stepped back just enough to hand me a small flash drive. "I'm directing a documentary," he continued. "The Forgotten Voices of America. We're highlighting stories people overlook. I need someone who can make the invisible heard." His words tangled in my chest. I glanced past him at the street below, empty, shimmering with rain. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're not afraid of quiet," he said. "And because you understand what it feels like to be ignored." I almost laughed, but it came out shaky. "That's not exactly on my resume." He smiled, patient. "Sometimes the world silences the right voices. Maybe it's time yours was heard." Then he left the drive on the table near my door and disappeared down the hallway, leaving faint footprints on the carpet. For a long time I stood there, door half open, the city still alive outside. Then I shut it and stared at the flash drive as if it might vanish. The label was handwritten in black ink: Voices Project, initial concept. I poured another half glass of champagne and sat on the floor, my back against the couch. Through the walls, laughter from other apartments echoed celebration that didn't include me. My father's words still rang in my head, circling like a cruel melody. No one would notice if you didn't show up. The truth was, I hadn't been invited. A week ago, my mother had called, her tone perfectly polite. "Sweetheart, the guest list is very limited this year. We just want Lauren to shine on camera. You understand, don't you?" And I had lied. "Of course, Mom. I have other plans." Those plans were sitting alone with a frozen dinner, watching them toast my sister's success. I picked up the flash drive, plugged it into my laptop, and pressed play. A voiceover began, Ethan's calm and steady, speaking about forgotten towns, overlooked workers, unsung artists. But it was the silence between his words that caught me. Space. Breathing room. I could already hear what it could become. I reached for my recorder, the same battered one I'd carried since college. It still held old files, rain hitting windows, coffee machines, trains, people whispering in bus terminals. The soundtrack of invisibility. My kind of language. I added a new track, the faint thump of fireworks outside the echo, off wet pavement, my own breathing steady and soft. Then, without planning it, I whispered, "No one would notice." The recorder caught the sound and looped it. I layered the loop beneath the rain, and something strange happened. The words no longer sounded like pain. They sounded like rhythm, like resolve. At some point, the fireworks stopped. The city fell back into its usual hush. I lay on the carpet, staring at the ceiling, headphones still on. In the dark, I replayed the new mix. It felt unfinished but alive. I closed my eyes and let the noise wash over me until it turned into calm. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Lauren or my parents or the party I'd been erased from. I was thinking about sound, how it could tell a story when words couldn't. The next morning, I woke to a pale gray light leaking through the blinds. The flash drive sat on my desk, small and silent as if waiting. I made coffee and played back the track again. It still held something raw, something worth finishing. Maybe this was the chance I'd been waiting for, the one that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Before noon, I drafted an email. Ethan, this is Clara. I listened to your project. I think I can help you find its voice. I hovered over the send button, my finger trembling. Part of me still heard my father's laughter, my mother's careful disappointment. But another voice, my own, rose quietly behind them, saying, "Do it." I clicked send. The whoosh of the email leaving my outbox sounded louder than any applause. Outside Seattle was wrapped in mist, the kind that blurred edges and softened colors. The kind of morning that belonged to people like me, half seen, half heard. I slipped on my coat and stepped out onto the balcony. Down below, the street glistened from last night's rain traffic, humming like a slow heartbeat. I lifted my phone, pressed record, and captured the sound. It wasn't much, just wind drizzle and the faint pulse of the city, but it was proof. Proof that even the quiet things leave a trace. Later, I saved the file under a new name, Midnight Uninvited. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny recording would start everything that came after the recognition, the storm, the revenge, the peace. As the sky brightened, I whispered to myself, they built their world on light and cameras. Mine will rise from sound and silence. The city breathed with me. The noise didn't hurt anymore. It sounded like beginning. Rain tapped against my window like a slow metronome. Seattle never truly slept after New Year's, but that morning it felt like the whole city was nursing a hangover from celebration. I stared at my phone, dozens of unread messages blinking up at me. Saw your family on TV. Looked amazing. Where were you? I didn't bother replying. Every text felt like a reminder that I was missing from a picture everyone else seemed to admire. I made coffee, watched it swirl in the cup, and tried to drown the bitterness that wasn't from caffeine. The truth was, this wasn't new. My whole life had been a rehearsal for being unseen. Growing up in the Bennett household meant existing in someone else's spotlight. My father, Richard, was a man who measured love in accomplishments. My mother, Elaine, treated reputation like religion. And Lauren, perfect Lauren, was their miracle child, the golden girl who sparkled on cue. I was just the quiet one. The one who liked to record the world instead of performing for it. They used to joke that if Lauren was the melody, I was the background hum. It was meant to sound affectionate. It never did. When I was 9, Lauren got her first standing ovation. She'd won a children's speech contest, the entire auditorium applauding as my parents rose to their feet, glowing with pride. Afterward, Dad crouched down beside me, still grinning. "Maybe next year you'll find something you're good at too," he said, ruffling my hair, as though encouragement could erase the sting. That night, I sat in my room with a tape recorder and captured the applause through the wall. When I played it back, it didn't sound happy. It sounded hollow, like rain trapped in a jar. Mom loved planning parties, fundraisers, dinners that looked like magazine spreads. Every event was a stage, and every stage belonged to Lauren. My job was to help, handing her lipstick, adjusting her dress, holding her coat. Once I brought her a small handmade gift before one of her piano recitals, a music box I'd built from scraps, recorded with a melody I composed myself. When she opened it, the sound wavered and buzzed. Dad laughed, clapping her on the shoulder. "Maybe your sister will make background music for your shows someday." Everyone chuckled politely. I smiled because I had to. Later, I took the box apart piece by piece until it was silent. The years blurred together like an old recording. Lauren became the face of Seattle Sunrise, all perfect posture and polished words. My parents adored telling people that she took after her father, as though I was an unrelated experiment gone wrong. I studied sound engineering, freelanced, quietly built a modest career that never made headlines. Every time I tried to share my projects, Mom would tilt her head in that pitying way and say, "That's sweet, honey, but maybe focus on something more stable." What she meant was something we can brag about. The Christmas before everything unraveled, the house was dressed in gold. Strings of lights curved perfectly along the windows, candles flickered across the dining table, and a small orchestra played near the fireplace. Dad made a toast to Lauren's success, holding up her magazine cover like a trophy. "Our bright star," he said. I was standing behind the camera recording the whole thing for their social media page. When the champagne glasses clinked, the reflection in the lens caught my face half hidden behind the equipment. I looked like hired help. After everyone left that night, I found Mom in the kitchen rearranging the silverware for no reason. "The forks looked fine," I said softly. She smiled without looking up. "Perfection never ends, sweetheart." I wanted to ask if she ever noticed how her version of perfection had no space for me. But I swallowed it the way I always did. A week before New Year's Eve, she called me to her office, a gleaming room full of planners and glossy invitations. Her voice was calm, rehearsed. "This year's celebration will be televised. It's a big deal for Lauren's brand. We've decided to keep the guest list smaller, more curated." I knew what that meant before she finished. "You're saying I'm not invited?" She hesitated only for a second. "It's not like that. We just want to let Lauren shine." "Then what am I supposed to do?" She folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Enjoy your evening. Watch the broadcast maybe." I laughed, but it came out sharp. "You're cutting your own daughter from the family party." Her expression didn't change. "You've always been sensitive, Clara. This isn't personal." Later that night, my father texted, "It's for everyone's good. You're not exactly the spotlight type. No one would notice." I stared at the message until my screen dimmed. My hands shook not from anger but from the terrible familiarity of it. I'd spent a lifetime being told to understand, to accept, to stay small. But something about seeing those words written out cold, permanent, made something shift inside me. I deleted the message, but the words stayed branded in my mind. That evening I walked through the city alone. Storefronts glittered with New Year's decorations, couples hurried past holding hands, and street musicians played jazz on every corner. I stopped at Pike Place Market, where an old man played violin beneath the awning, his case open for tips. His music wove through the rain, soft but unbreakable. I closed my eyes and recorded it. The bow scraped slightly off-key. The raindrops hit his sleeve, a bus sighed in the distance. It was imperfect and alive, everything my family's world wasn't. When I got home, I plugged the recorder into my laptop. The file opened with static, then the violin's trembling notes. I layered in the hum of my refrigerator, the ticking of my wall clock, the faint sirens from outside. Together they sounded like a heartbeat, fragile, stubborn. I saved it as rain beneath fireworks. The next morning I woke to Ethan's email confirming our meeting at Harbor Studio. I should have felt excited, but a strange fear sat heavy in my chest. The last time someone said they believed in me, it had been Lauren's college boyfriend who asked me to help mix her demo because you have that techie ear. She got a regional award for that track. My name was never mentioned. Still, something about Ethan's tone had been different, sincere, curious. I made a deal with myself: if he turned out to be another person looking to use me, I'd walk away for good. I spent the rest of the day cleaning my tiny apartment, a nervous ritual. While dusting the shelf, I found the old music box I'd destroyed years ago. The lid was dented, the crank half broken, but when I turned it, it gave off a faint hum, distorted but recognizable. My younger self's voice whispered back through it, clumsy, imperfect, but real. I realized then that sound doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting to be found again. Outside, the rain grew heavier. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, watching the blurred lights of traffic. For years I had believed invisibility was safety. Now I knew it was just a slower kind of death. I picked up my recorder, set it on the window ledge, and let it capture the sound of the storm. That night I lay in bed, listening to it, the steady rhythm of water against glass. It was the same sound I'd been hearing since childhood, yet somehow it felt different. Like the city was breathing with me, reminding me I wasn't erased, just waiting to be heard. When I finally drifted to sleep, my dreams were filled with echoes, my father's voice fading into thunder, my mother's laughter dissolving into static, Lauren's applause melting into rain. And beneath it all, a quieter sound pulsed steady, insistent, alive. By morning, the storm had cleared. The streets shimmered, washed clean. I checked my inbox again, Ethan's email glowing like a tiny lighthouse. I whispered to myself, they built their world on light and cameras. Mine will rise from sound and silence. For the first time in a long while, I believed it. Harbor Studio sat at the end of a narrow street that smelled like salt and wet concrete. The sign above the glass doors flickered faintly, half of the neon letters burned out, leaving only Har or Stu.io. Somehow, that felt right. Everything in my life seemed half lit, half seen. I took a breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the air hummed with low-frequency vibrations, machines, cables, the whisper of instruments asleep. A young assistant looked up from behind the mixing console and smiled politely. "You're Clara Bennett, right? Ethan's expecting you." He led me down a corridor lined with photos of past projects, documentaries, indie albums, soundtracks for films I'd loved without realizing they'd been made here. Ethan was waiting in the recording booth, sleeves rolled up, headphones around his neck. He looked different in daylight, tired, older but steady. "You came," he said simply. I smiled faintly. "You sounded too curious to ignore." He gestured toward a stool beside the mixing desk. "I listened to the track you sent me, Midnight Uninvited. There's honesty in it. Pain too, but it's honest pain. I recorded it after my family's party," I admitted. "I figured." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's exactly what this project needs. Not polished sound. Humanity." He explained his idea, a docu-series capturing everyday people whose voices were lost in the noise: immigrants, factory workers, night shift nurses, foster kids. He wanted sound to be the heartbeat, not the background. "Most documentaries show people," he said. "I want mine to let them be heard." The way he said heard made something in my chest shift. "You want to turn silence into a story." "Exactly." He smiled, eyes lighting up. "And you already know how." For the next hour, we listened to clips together, field recordings from across the country. The rumble of subway trains, a woman humming to herself in a laundromat, wind scraping against broken windows of an abandoned mill. It was imperfect, raw, and alive. My hands itched to rearrange it, to give shape to the chaos. "Can I?" I asked. He nodded. I pulled the laptop closer and began mixing, layering the hum of machines with the woman's hum, letting the wind rise like a sigh. Ethan watched quietly, his expression unreadable until the last sound faded. That, he said finally, was empathy turned into sound. I felt heat rise to my cheeks. It's nothing just instinct, it's vision. We worked for hours. Outside, daylight faded to dusk, the studio lights glowing soft amber. Between edits, Ethan asked about my family. I tried to dodge it, but his tone was gentle, not prying. "My parents run a real estate company," I said. "They like control. They like things that look expensive. And you, I like things that sound real." He nodded like he understood more than I'd said. By the time we finished, the first episode had its spine echoes of the forgotten. Ethan leaned back, stretching. "You know, when I called you that night, I wasn't sure you'd answer. Why'd you take the chance?" "Because sometimes the right people show up when no one expects them to." I laughed softly. "Funny. My family just spent an entire night proving the opposite." He smiled. "Then maybe this is your New Year's party." It was past midnight when I left the studio. The streets glistened with rain. My reflection followed me in every puddle, blurred but visible. For once, I didn't hate seeing it. Back home, my voicemail was full, messages from my mother, Lauren, and even one from Dad. I hesitated, then played the first one. Mom's voice controlled and sugary as ever. Clara, we missed you at the gala. It went beautifully. I hope you watched. Lauren looks stunning. The second Lauren. Hey, sorry about what Dad said. He was just joking. You know how he is. Anyway, maybe we can grab lunch this week. Then Dad, you're too sensitive, Clara. That's your problem. Try being happy for your sister for once. I deleted all three and stared at the wall until the silence felt heavier than the words had. Then I opened my laptop and played back the project. The sound of strangers, people who didn't know me, didn't judge me, filled the room like company. Over the next few weeks, I spent every spare hour at Harbor Studio. Ethan pushed me, but never harshly. Don't chase beauty, he'd say. Chase truth. Sometimes that truth hurt. Listening to recordings of people confessing loneliness made me face my own. A woman spoke about being invisible at her own wedding. A man described working 15-hour shifts just to prove he mattered. Every story echoed something inside me. One evening, as we adjusted levels on a track, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you ever think about making something about your story?" I froze. Mine. Yes. You talk about silence like it's a friend and an enemy at once. That's power. That's art. I shook my head. People wouldn't care. They already do, he said softly. They just don't know it's you. That night, lying in bed, his words haunted me. For years, I'd lived like a muted version of myself, letting Lauren and my parents define what worth looked like. But maybe sound could tell what words never could, a story that didn't ask for permission. By the third week, our project had a pulse. Ethan decided to pitch it to a streaming network. They'll love it, he said confidently, especially your piece, the rain sequence. When the meeting came, I sat beside him in a conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. Suits filled the table, eyes sharp, polite smiles practiced. Ethan did the talking. I just played the demo. When the last note faded, the room was silent. Then one executive leaned forward. Who designed the sound? Ethan nodded toward me. She did. The man studied me, impressed. It's haunting. You took something ordinary and made it emotional. It's like you gave the noise a soul. My heart pounded. For the first time, someone important had said those words to me, not to my sister. The deal went through. They ordered 3 episodes. Ethan shook my hand after the meeting, grinning. Welcome to the team. On the way out, my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Call me. Family emergency. My stomach dropped. I found a corner in the lobby and dialed. Mom. Oh, thank God, she said, her voice tight. Clara, there's a problem with the press. What kind of problem? She exhaled shakily. Some gossip page twisted what your father said on TV. They're painting him as cruel. It's terrible for the company image. I blinked, stunned. You mean when he said no one would notice if I didn't show up? That line was taken out of context, she snapped. You know he jokes. I laughed bitterly. I lived the context, Mom. Her tone sharpened. Clara, this isn't about feelings. This is about our name. I need you to post something, say it was harmless, that you weren't offended. Put it on social media. I stared at the elevator doors, watching my reflection tremble. You want me to fix your image. You're part of this family, she said firmly. Start acting like it. My throat tightened. Maybe you should have remembered that when you left me off the guest list. Before she could reply, I ended the call. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still bruised with clouds. I walked toward the studio, the echo of my parents' voices chasing me like ghosts. For the first time, though, their noise didn't drown me. It fueled me. That night, I stayed late, mixing a new track, something raw and sharp. It began with silence, then layered in fragments of voices, laughter, applause, faint insults. Finally, a single word cut through enough. When I played it back, the sound hit like a heartbeat. I named it The Extra. Ethan found me the next morning asleep on the studio couch. He listened to the track without speaking, then turned to me. This isn't just sound design anymore. It's truth. I rubbed my eyes. It's my truth. He smiled, nodding slowly. Then let's make sure the world hears it. And just like that, something inside me shifted for good. For the first time, my silence wasn't a cage, it was a weapon. The first screening was held in a small downtown theater that smelled faintly of popcorn and old velvet. Only a few journalists and local artists had been invited, but my pulse hammered as if the whole world was waiting. The lights dimmed, and the opening frame of Echoes of the Forgotten appeared on screen. Ethan's name first, then mine, in smaller text, just beneath sound design, by Clara Bennett. My fingers clenched around the armrest. I'd spent years being invisible. Seeing my name projected onto a wall felt like stepping out of the dark. The first sounds were mine. Rain against metal rooftops. A train whistle fading into the distance. The quiet sigh of a woman whispering, "I'm still here." The room stilled. No one coughed, no one moved. My heart swelled and twisted at the same time. When the credits rolled, silence lingered for several seconds before the applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger. People rose from their seats clapping. Ethan looked over at me smiling. "They heard you," he said. Afterward, a young journalist approached me, eyes bright. "Your sound work, it feels personal," she said. Was it inspired by something? I hesitated, thinking of my father's toast, my mother's perfect smile, the empty chair that had been mine. "Everything we create comes from somewhere," I said finally. She smiled knowingly. "Then, wherever it came from, I hope you go back there. The pain makes it real." Outside, the night air smelled like rain again. The city glowed under the streetlights, slick and alive. Ethan walked beside me, hands in his pockets. "You did it," he said. That silence in the room, that's power. It felt like holding my breath for an hour, I admitted. Then realizing I could finally exhale, he laughed quietly. "Get used to it. They're going to want more from you now." He was right. Within a week, the network called. The pilot episode was trending, drawing unexpected attention online. A headline on a streaming site read, "Echoes of the Forgotten captures the sound of empathy." My inbox flooded with requests for interviews. One email, though, stopped me cold. The sender's name glared from the screen, Elaine Bennett. The message was short, "Saw the episode. Call me." I almost deleted it. But curiosity, or maybe old habit, won. When I finally called, her voice came through smooth and polished like it always had been. "Clara," she began, "I watched your little film." "It's not a film, Mom. It's a docuseries." Yes, of course. "I didn't realize you were pursuing this full time. I didn't realize you cared." She ignored the jab. "Your father's concerned. Some of your followers online are bringing up the New Year's Eve comment again. They're saying he silenced you. This could hurt the company." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "He did silence me. You both did. Now it's just recorded." Her voice sharpened. "You're being ungrateful. We gave you every opportunity to be quiet," I said. A pause. Then the icy composure returned. "I'm only calling to ask you to be careful what you say in interviews. People will twist things." "People already did," I said softly. "And it wasn't strangers." She sighed, long and theatrical. "You've always been dramatic, Clara. Just remember, you're a Bennett. That name used to mean something to me," I whispered. "Not anymore." I hung up before she could reply. When I looked up, Ethan was standing at the studio doorway watching me. I hadn't realized he'd overheard. "Family?" he asked gently. "Ghosts," I said. "They call when they feel me breathing." He didn't push. "Channel it. Don't waste it." Over the next month, we worked nonstop. The second episode, Steel and Silence, followed a former shipyard worker who'd lost his hearing after an explosion. His voice cracked when he said, "The world went quiet before I was ready." I built the soundscape from fragments, a heartbeat, then nothing but muffled waves. When we premiered it, people cried in the theater. Afterward, a producer from New York called to discuss expanding the series. The night before the deal, I got another message from my sister. "Lauren, can we meet?" I almost didn't answer, but part of me wanted to see if she'd changed. We met at a cafe overlooking the harbor, the same place we'd eaten birthday pancakes as kids. She wore sunglasses, even though it was cloudy, the subtle armor of someone used to being watched. "Clara," she said softly, sliding into the booth. "You look different." "Alive," I offered. She smiled weakly. "I deserve that. Look, I know things have been tense." "Tense," I laughed. "You stood there while they cut me from the family party. You smiled while they laughed at me." "I didn't know what to do," she said. "I was always supposed to be the good one, the one who kept peace." "Peace," I repeated. "Peace is just what they call it when I stay quiet." She flinched. For a moment I saw guilt flicker behind her perfect composure. "Mom's worried. Dad's furious. They think you're trying to humiliate them." "I'm not," I said honestly. "I'm just not protecting them anymore." "Do you hate us that much?" I shook my head. "Hate's easy. I just stopped needing you." She reached across the table, touching my hand lightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For all of it." I wanted to pull away, but something in her voice disarmed me. It sounded real small but real. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said quietly, "but I can start by not pretending anymore." Lauren nodded, eyes glassy. "Then maybe that's enough." When I got back to the studio that night, Ethan and the team were celebrating. The series had been greenlit for a national release. He poured champagne into paper cups and handed me one. "To voices finally being heard," he said. "To the forgotten," I replied. As the others laughed and toasted, I slipped away to the mixing room. The hum of machines filled the air, comforting and steady. I pulled out my recorder, the same one I'd used that New Year's Eve, and pressed record. "This is for them," I murmured, "for the ones who clap at the wrong times, who never get their name on the invitation, who are told their quiet doesn't matter." I added a faint piano loop beneath my voice, the notes trembling like they were afraid to be too loud. Then I whispered, "I hear you." The red light on the recorder blinked once, twice, then faded as I stopped. I leaned back in the chair, breathing deeply. The room was dark except for the glow from the console. That night as I left, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass door. Same face, same eyes, but the woman looking back didn't flinch anymore. She looked steady, certain, alive. The next morning, news alerts filled my phone. Echoes of the Forgotten was officially trending. Critics called it a haunting masterpiece of truth. Ethan's inbox overflowed with offers, partnerships, endorsements. But buried between them was one message addressed directly to me from a producer in Los Angeles. "Your sound work is extraordinary. Let's talk about a solo project." For a long time, I just stared at the email. Me, the extra, the uninvited, the one no one would notice. Outside, the rain started again, gentle and rhythmic. I smiled and whispered, "I notice." Then I hit reply. Los Angeles smelled different, warm asphalt, ocean salt, and faint citrus from the trees that lined the streets. The sunlight felt too confident, too bright for someone like me who had built her world in gray. I stepped out of the taxi in front of Meridian Studios, a sleek glass building with a name that looked expensive enough to demand silence. My palms were damp, my stomach tight. This was the meeting. The one Ethan said could change everything. Inside, the lobby gleamed like a museum. A receptionist with red lipstick smiled mechanically. "Clara Bennett, they're expecting you." She handed me a visitor badge with my name printed perfectly, no typos, no confusion, no missed identity. It felt almost unsettling to see it treated like it mattered. The producer, David Lang, met me in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Pacific. He was in his 40s, tanned, confident, his handshake firm. "I'm a huge fan of Echoes of the Forgotten," he said, settling across from me. "The sound raw, vulnerable, brave. You made the quiet feel like a character." "That's the point," I said softly. "Silence isn't absence, it's evidence." He grinned. "Beautiful. That's exactly why I called. I want you to design a standalone feature, your own piece. Something immersive. Maybe call it The Human Frequency. The world through sound from your perspective." My pulse jumped. My own project, he nodded. Full creative control. You'll have a team budget press. I think you could redefine the field, Clara. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I'd spent years being the background noise in my family's show. Now someone was offering me a stage. I'd like that, I said quietly. A lot. David smiled, sliding a folder across the table. Then, let's make history. The contract glittered with promise and danger. The figure at the bottom was higher than I'd ever imagined. I signed, and just like that, my life tilted. When I called Ethan that night, he sounded proud, if a little hesitant. You deserve it, he said. Just remember, control comes with noise. The bigger the audience, the louder the static. I laughed nervously. I can handle noise, maybe, he said softly. But not all noise is meant to be heard. In the weeks that followed, the human frequency consumed me. My small apartment filled with microphones, cable speakers, and late-night coffee cups. I recorded everything: wind tunneling through subway grates, babies laughing in grocery stores, the metallic hum of power lines. Each sound felt alive, like an emotion trying to escape. I layered them until they breathed. The more I worked, the less I slept. Sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd catch my reflection in the dark window, eyes wide, face pale, but awake in a way I'd never been before. I was building something that didn't need permission, something no family name could tarnish. Still, the calls came. My mother left voicemails I refused to return. Clara, people are asking questions. Why are you telling stories that make us look cruel? My father sent one message that simply said, "Stop embarrassing the family." I deleted it without listening twice, but Lauren's text stayed unread for days. They're not doing well, Clara. Please just talk to them. I couldn't. Not yet. One afternoon, Ethan flew down from Seattle to see me. He walked into my studio, if you could call it, that stepping over tangled cords and soundboards. You've been busy, he said, looking around. It's more than busy, I replied. It's alive. He nodded, impressed. But then his eyes caught on the screen. The waveform displayed there wasn't wind or laughter. It was the recording from New Year's Eve. My father's voice saying, "No one would notice if Clara didn't show up." Ethan's face changed. "Why is that here?" "It's part of the foundation," I said simply. "Every project has to start somewhere." He crossed his arms. "You're turning pain into content. Now it's not content. It's truth." He studied me for a long moment. "Just make sure you still recognize the difference." After he left, I stared at the waveform for hours. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't delete it. It was the pulse of everything I was creating, the sound that had burned itself into my skin. A week later, I flew back to Seattle for the first major screening of Echoes. The plane descended through thick gray clouds, and my chest tightened as the city came into view. I hadn't been home since that night. The air smelled like pine and rain, familiar but heavier. The event was held in a renovated theater downtown. When I walked in, I caught sight of Lauren near the back. She looked smaller than I remembered, her confidence worn down. Our eyes met briefly, and she smiled weakly before looking away. During the panel discussion, a reporter asked Ethan, "Where did the idea of silence as storytelling come from?" He glanced at me, then answered carefully, "From Clara." Her understanding of quiet changed the project. Applause followed, but I barely heard it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my parents standing at the exit, their expressions unreadable. Afterward, I found them waiting outside beneath the awning. My mother's lipstick was perfect, even in the drizzle. "You looked very professional," she said. My father crossed his arms. "You think humiliating us on national television is success," I sighed. "Dad, no one said your names." "They didn't need to," he snapped. "People can connect dots." I met his glare steadily. "Then maybe you shouldn't have drawn them so clearly," Mom cut in quickly. "Clara, we're not here to argue. We just want this to stop before it destroys everything we built." "What you built?" I asked softly. "Or what you faked?" Her face tightened. "You've always misunderstood us." "No," I said. "I finally understand." They stared at me like I was speaking another language. The rain thickened, drumming against the awning, and for once I didn't fill the silence. I let it sit there, heavy, honest, unforgiving. When they left, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Something inside me loosened like a knot finally giving way. That night, Lauren came to my hotel. She stood awkwardly at the doorway holding a small box. "Mom wanted you to have this," she said. She said it's from before everything went wrong. Inside was a photo of the four of us at a summer fair. I was maybe 12, wearing a headset too big for my head, pointing at something off camera. Everyone else was smiling for the lens. "I looked like I was listening to something only I could hear," Lauren said quietly. "She's scared, Clara. Not for the company, for you. She says this revenge will eat you." I laughed softly. "Maybe it already has." Lauren frowned. "You're not her mistake, you know. You're just what she doesn't understand." I looked down at the photo again. Maybe. But understanding doesn't fix what's broken. When she left, I placed the photo face down on the desk. I opened my laptop and played back the human frequency. The track started with a low hum, the same tone that haunted my childhood home, and then it grew louder, fuller, evolving into something almost like a heartbeat. I turned up the volume until it filled the room, drowning out the rain, the city, the ghosts. For a long time, I just sat there and listened. Ethan's words replayed in my mind. Not all noise is meant to be heard, but mine was, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be perfect. I was just trying to be real. And real, I realized, was finally loud enough. The morning after the screening, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Every outlet in Seattle seemed to have my face on it. Sound designer exposes family divide. Bennett daughter speaks through silence, from black sheep to breakout visionary. I scrolled through the headlines until my thumb hurt, each one twisting something deeper inside me. I'd spent so long trying to be invisible. Now I'd become unavoidable. By noon, Ethan called. His voice was calm but heavy. "You're trending nationwide," he said. "The network's thrilled, but your family, I know," I interrupted. "I've seen the comments. They're going to fight back," he warned. "Just remember what's real. Don't let noise define you." But the noise was already everywhere. My inbox overflowed with interview requests. Some wanted to talk about the documentary. Most wanted gossip, the inside story of the Bennett feud. I ignored them all except one message that stood out. The sender's name was simple: Lauren. Her email was short. "They're falling apart, Clara. Please call me before it gets worse." I didn't reply. Instead, I poured myself into the human frequency. The project had grown bigger than I imagined. David's production team in Los Angeles had rented an entire studio space complete with interns and brand consultants. Every day, someone new asked me to explain my vision. They wanted catchy taglines, photo shoots, color palettes, things that turned meaning into marketing. One afternoon, as I reviewed a sound sample, a young assistant named Max poked his head in. "Clara, the PR department wants a quote about your family redemption arc. They think it'll boost pre-orders." I looked up sharply. "It's not a redemption arc, it's a story about perception." He hesitated. "Sure, but people love redemption. Makes them feel better." "Tell them to use someone else's trauma for comfort," I said, my voice sharper than I meant. After he left, I sat back, exhaling hard. My studio felt smaller than ever, like even the walls were closing and echoing with other people's expectations. That evening, Ethan called again. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said automatically. He didn't buy it. "You sound like someone walking through applause she doesn't believe in." I smiled despite myself. "You always did have a way with words." "Promise me something," he said. "When this blows up, and it will, don't lose the reason you started. You weren't fighting for revenge. You were fighting to be heard." His words stayed with me long after the call ended. The following week, the human frequency previewed online. Within hours, it exploded. The teaser video, just 60 seconds of layered sound, was shared hundreds of thousands of times. People wrote in the comments, "This feels like grief and rebirth." She turned silence into protest. Finally, a woman who refused to disappear. But fame is a strange mirror. It reflects everything, even what you don't want to see. Beneath the praise were crueler comments. She humiliated her family for clout. Another narcissist hiding behind art. If no one noticed her before, maybe there was a reason. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I was too busy to read them. But at 3 a.m, lying in bed with the glow of my phone on my face, I read every word. 2 days later, Lauren called. I didn't expect to answer, but somehow I did. Her voice was raw, unsteady. Dad's losing it, Clara. Reporters keep calling. Mom won't leave the house. You have to say something. What do you want me to say? I asked quietly. That they were right. No, she said, and I heard tears in her voice. Just that you didn't mean to destroy them. I closed my eyes, remembering the night they'd cut me out of the party. The way Dad's laughter had filled the room while mine had drowned in silence. I didn't destroy them, Lauren. I just stopped protecting the illusion. There was a pause. They're still your parents, she whispered. Where I said, that's past tense. I hung up before she could reply. Later that week, Ethan flew into town for a meeting with David. We met at a rooftop cafe overlooking the ocean. The city stretched beneath us, calm and gray. Ethan looked at me with quiet concern. You're everywhere, Clara, but you don't look happy. I stared at the horizon. Fame is just another kind of silence. It's loud, but it doesn't listen back. He smiled sadly. You sound like someone who's about to set herself on fire just to stay warm. I'm fine, I said, though we both knew it was a lie. After lunch, I returned to the studio and worked late into the night. The team had gone home, leaving the building empty. I sat alone in the sound booth, surrounded by blinking lights. On my desk, the old recorder sat waiting, the same one I'd used on New Year's Eve. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room, faint but unmistakable. No one would notice if Clara didn't show up. The words no longer stung. They vibrated through me like fuel. I layered them under a new track, a deep, resonant hum that sounded almost human. Then I added rain. Always the rain. The composition grew heavier, sharper, until it felt like a storm. Then I whispered into the mic, "You notice now." I called the track Erasure. When I played it back, the sound hit me like thunder, both terrifying and cleansing. For the first time, I didn't cry. I smiled. The next morning, David burst into my studio waving a tablet. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The press picked up your latest piece. The Times wants to run a feature, 'The Woman Who Made Silence Loud.' They're calling you a pioneer." My chest tightened. "And what does that make my family?" He hesitated. "Collateral." That night, guilt gnawed at me. I sat on the balcony with my laptop reading the article. They quoted my work, my philosophy, even my childhood memories pulled from old interviews. But the last line made me freeze. Her father, Richard Bennett, declined to comment. I closed the laptop and stared into the city, lights, their reflections blurring with the tears I refused to shed. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I almost ignored it, but instinct made me answer. "Clara," a voice said. "My father's." Hoarse, unfamiliar. "We need to talk." I said nothing. He continued, slower this time. "This family can't survive another scandal. You've made your point. Congratulations. Now stop." My throat went dry. "Stop being myself. Stop embarrassing us," he snapped. Then softer, "I never meant what I said that night." I laughed bitterly. "You meant every word. You just didn't mean for the world to hear it." "Clara, goodbye, Dad." I hung up and let the silence sit there, heavy and final. The following morning I woke early, exhaustion clinging to me like smoke. I brewed coffee and opened the window. The city was quiet, too quiet. For a moment I thought about how much had changed. My name was everywhere. My family's name was in ruins. The world had finally noticed me. And yet I'd never felt lonelier. I pressed record on my laptop, whispering to myself, "They erased me once. I erased them back. Then after a long pause, I added, but maybe revenge was just another way of asking to be seen. The recording captured everything, the breath, the ache, the faint tremor of doubt. When I stopped, I titled it Echoes Part 2. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall again, soft and steady. I closed my eyes and listened. It didn't sound like sadness anymore. It sounded like warning, like the calm before something bigger. And deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over yet. 2 months after the Human Frequency release, I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop. Notifications flooded the screen, mentions, tags, headlines. CNN ran a segment titled, From Extra to Icon, Clara Bennett and the Art of Being Heard. I scrolled through comments faster than I could read them. Some called me brave, others called me cruel. Somewhere between those two labels I existed now. Across the country, my family's name had turned sour. A business magazine wrote, The fall of Bennett Group mirrors the rise of the daughter they dismissed. I didn't share the article, but everyone else did. Reporters circled our story like vultures. For the first time, people weren't talking about Lauren's perfect hair or my father's empire. They were talking about the silence I'd shattered. By the end of that week, my email box looked like chaos. Interview requests from New York invitations to panels, podcast producers, begging to talk about family trauma and artistic transformation. I said no to almost everything. The noise was deafening, and for all its glory, it didn't feel like triumph. When I finally stepped outside, I was recognized. A woman stopped me near a coffee shop and whispered, "Thank you for making me feel seen." Her eyes were wet. I smiled, politely unsure what to do with her gratitude. After she left, I stood there holding my latte, wondering why appreciation felt heavier than shame ever had. That night I called Ethan. "They're turning me into a symbol," I said. "I don't want to be one." He laughed softly. "You already are. But you can choose what kind of symbol." "I wanted justice," I murmured. "Not fame." "They come in the same box sometimes," he replied. "You just have to decide which parts to keep." Meanwhile, the Bennett family empire kept unraveling. News broke that several real estate projects had been frozen due to financial irregularities. A local channel aired footage of my father leaving a courthouse looking smaller than I remembered, his jaw tight. My mother's letter to the press, an attempt to clarify misunderstandings, was torn apart online. Someone commented, "Now she knows what it's like to be silenced." Lauren's talk show went on temporary hiatus. I watched a clip of her giving a forced smile on camera, thanking viewers for their support. She looked like a ghost of herself, still polished but hollow behind the eyes. I didn't celebrate. I couldn't. Revenge wasn't supposed to taste like this, dry, stale, flavorless. Late one evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lauren. "Can we meet? I can't do this anymore." We met in a small cafe tucked behind Pike Street Market. She wasn't wearing makeup, and for once, she didn't look like the woman from TV. Her hands shook as she held her cup. "They've turned on me," she said quietly. "The network, the fans. Everyone thinks I helped cover for Dad." I said nothing. She looked up, her voice breaking. "Mom's barely leaving the house. Dad won't speak to anyone. Clara, they're blaming me for everything." I took a slow breath. "You stayed quiet when they erased me." "I was scared," she said. "They made me believe I'd lose them too." "You didn't lose them," I said flatly. "You lost yourself." Lauren's eyes filled. "You're right. I did. But I can't keep living like this. They need you, Clara." "Need me?" I almost laughed. For what damage control, her silence answered for her. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window. Outside, the city buzzed with the kind of indifference only big places have. "I'm done saving them," I said finally. Lauren reached for my hand, her fingers trembling. "I'm not asking you to save them. I'm asking you to save yourself from becoming them." The words landed harder than I wanted to admit. We sat there for a long time, watching rain slide down the glass. When she left, she hugged me like it might be the last time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to my recordings, play softly through the speaker's footsteps, laughter, rain, applause. It all blurred into one endless hum. I thought about what Lauren said. Was I becoming the same monster that made me Ethan called the next morning? You okay? I met Lauren, I said. She wants me to go home. And you, I don't know. Maybe part of me wants to see what's left. Be careful, he warned. They'll use your guilt if you let them. But there was something else in his tone, something almost proud. What I asked. He hesitated, then said, "You've changed the way people see silence, Clara. You've done what most of us only talk about." I exhaled slowly. Then why doesn't it feel like victory? Because victory isn't peace, he said softly. It's just the space before the next war. Later that afternoon, I met with Liam, the journalist who had written about the human frequency. He greeted me with a crooked grin. Still causing trouble, I see. He ordered 2 coffees, then leaned in. You know, Bennett Group's under federal investigation now, right? Fraud, political donations, shell companies. It's ugly. My chest tightened. You're sure I've seen the files, he said. And guess what? Your father's signature is all over them. I stared at him, feeling cold all over. If this comes out, it will, he said. Soon. And when it does, they'll look to you. You're the only Bennett left the public still trusts. I rubbed my temples. I don't want to be part of their story again. You already are, Liam said quietly. But you could decide how it ends. That night I drove aimlessly through the city. Streetlights blurred past like streaks of gold. My father's words echoed in my mind. No one would notice if Clara didn't show up. He was wrong. The whole world noticed now. But what had I become to make that happen? When I reached the waterfront, I parked and sat there watching the waves slap against the dock. I pulled out my recorder and hit play. The sound of rain filled the car, gentle and rhythmic. I whispered into the mic, they built their empire on silence. Maybe it's time it collapses the same way. The next morning, an email arrived from a news outlet in New York requesting a feature interview. The subject line read, "Clara Bennett breaks her silence." I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen, then at the window beyond my desk. The world outside glowed with morning light, sharp and clear. Maybe Lauren was right. Maybe the only way to end the cycle wasn't to fight louder but to listen deeper. I closed my laptop and turned on my recorder one more time. I didn't know what I was going to capture, only that I needed to start somewhere new. As I stepped outside, the air smelled of salt and possibility. The rain had stopped, but the sky still looked heavy, like it was holding its breath. For once I didn't mind, because this time the storm would be mine to start. The news hit like thunder over breakfast. My phone buzzed across the counter, spilling headlines in all caps. Bennett Group under federal investigation. Real estate giant faces fraud charges. The silence finally speaks. I stared at the screen, half of me numb, the other half strangely calm. The empire my father built on appearances was collapsing one article at a time. I'd thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, all I felt was quiet. By noon, reporters had camped outside the Seattle mansion. The same gates that once guarded charity galas now framed humiliation. I turned on the TV and watched as cameras zoomed in on my father's grim face, while my mother walked behind him, clutching her purse like a shield. Lauren trailed last, trying to hide from the flashing lights. The anchor's voice carried the kind of satisfaction only scandal gives. The once revered Bennett family now faces serious allegations of fraud, falsified accounts, and political contributions under investigation. The sound faded under the memory of another broadcast a year ago, my father's toast laughter, the word extra, slicing through the air. For a moment, the two versions of him overlapped, the man who mocked me, and the one being stripped of his titles. I didn't know which was worse. By afternoon, my mother called. I ignored it twice before finally answering. Her voice trembled through the line, brittle and desperate. "Clara, it's all falling apart. Your father can't eat. Lauren's career is over. Please come home. I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. Why would I come back now? Because this family is dying, she said. You can help fix it. Fix it, I almost laughed. You broke it long before I left. She took a shaky breath. If you would just speak publicly, say we're reconciling, it might help calm things down. We need to protect the family name. There it was again. The family name. That sacred phrase that had suffocated me my entire life. You still think this is about saving the Bennett name, I said softly. It's not. It's about saving yourselves. Clara, she whispered. You owe us that much. The words hit harder than I expected. No, Mom, I said. If anything, you owe me. I hung up before she could reply. For hours I just sat there, letting the noise of the city seep through the window, the hum of traffic-distant sirens, the occasional burst of laughter. Outside, the world kept moving while theirs crumbled. And yet some small buried part of me couldn't ignore the ache behind her voice. When I told Ethan about the call, he frowned. They'll use you, Clara. They're drowning and they'll drag you down with them if you go back. I know, I said. But maybe drowning's the only way to learn how deep it really goes. He gave me that look, half worry, half respect. Then at least wear armor. 2 days later, I was on a plane back to Seattle. The sky outside the window was a dull gray sheet, heavy and endless. I hadn't been home in over a year, but the thought of walking into that house again made my stomach twist. When the car pulled up to the gates, I hesitated before stepping out. The mansion loomed the same as ever, perfectly trimmed hedges, stone pillars, windows that reflected nothing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and old gilt. My mother met me in the foyer. Her emerald dress shimmered beneath the chandelier, but her eyes were hollow. Clara, she said softly, as if my name might break her. Behind her, my father stood by the fireplace, his posture stiff, his face pale. You came, he said, but it sounded more like an accusation than gratitude. Lauren appeared at the top of the stairs, hands tucked into her sleeves, watching us. I barely recognized her. Dinner was tense from the first second. No one mentioned the investigation, though the silence around it was louder than any confession. The silverware clinked, the clock ticked, and my mother tried to fill the gaps with meaningless chatter. You look thinner, she said. Are you eating properly? I'm fine, I replied. How's your PR team holding up? My father's jaw tightened. We're not here to discuss business. Then what are we here for? I asked. He glared at me, eyes sharp but tired. For the family. To show unity. Unity, I echoed. After all this, he set his fork down, metal scraping the plate. You think you're better than us because of your little films. Don't forget where you came from. I haven't, I said. That's why I know I can't go back. The room went still. Even Lauren lowered her gaze. Finally, my mother whispered, Please, Clara. If you love us at all, help us make this right. I looked around the table, the same polished wood, the same gleaming candles. Once I would have done anything to earn a seat here. Now it felt like a stage I'd already outgrown. If I help, I said slowly, it won't be for your image. It'll be for the truth. My father scoffed. The truth doesn't sell. Then maybe that's why everything you built is falling apart, I said, standing up. No one stopped me as I walked down the hall. The house felt colder than I remembered. In my old bedroom, dust clung to the furniture, the air stale with disuse. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint outline where my posters used to hang. Memories drifted in. Lauren practicing speeches in the mirror, Dad rehearsing toasts, Mom rehearsing smiles. Everything rehearsed, everything fake. I pulled out my recorder from my bag and turned it on. The static filled the room like breathing. They still think silence is safety, I whispered. They still think lies can be polished into truth. A knock startled me. Lauren stood in the doorway, her face pale. There's something you should know, she said, closing the door behind her. They've agreed to do a televised interview next week, a family reconciliation special. They want you there. I blinked. You're kidding. They think it'll fix everything. Show the world we're united. I laughed, bitter and quiet. They want another performance. Her lips trembled. If you don't show up, they'll spin it against you. Say you refuse to help. And if I do, then maybe you can end it on your terms. I studied her face. She wasn't lying. Beneath the guilt there was fear, real fear. Fine, I said. If they want a show, I'll give them one. That night I lay awake listening to the rain hammering the roof. Every drop sounded like a heartbeat, steady and determined, around 2 a.m. I crept into the hallway, recorder in hand. Downstairs, my parents' voices drifted from the study. She'll show up, my father was saying. She wants attention too much not to. My mother's reply was cold. As long as she plays along, we'll be fine. The public loves forgiveness. I pressed the record button. Their voices filled the device sharp and clear. My hand shook not from fear but clarity. When the conversation ended, I slipped back into my room and replayed the tape. The sound was perfect, crisp, undeniable. Proof. Standing by the window, I watched the rain fall harder, streaking down the glass like ink. Somewhere inside me, anger and peace braided together into something fierce and final. They wanted redemption on their terms, I whispered into the recorder. Now they'll get truth on mine. The storm outside roared, wind rattling the panes, thunder rolling over the lake. For once, it didn't scare me. It sounded like the beginning of justice. The lights were blinding. The studio smelled like hairspray, coffee, and nerves. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my hands clasped together so tightly they ached. Across from me, my mother adjusted her pearls, pretending to smile. My father was already sweating under the stage lights, his jaw tight. Lauren sat between us, her perfect posture betraying the tremor in her hands. The host of Seattle Together beamed at the camera, oblivious to the storm simmering just beyond her set. Tonight, she announced, for the first time in a year, the Bennett family reunites to talk about forgiveness, redemption, and moving forward. Applause filled the studio. It sounded rehearsed. Everything did. My father leaned toward his mic, his tone smooth and heavy with practiced sincerity. Families fight, but we've chosen to forgive each other and remember what matters most: love and unity. The audience murmured approvingly. My mother followed her voice, trembling just enough to sound human. Clara's success has been a blessing. We're proud of her, truly. Every family has its misunderstandings. I smiled faintly. Misunderstandings. That was one word for years of silence, cruelty, and exile. The host turned to me. And you, Clara, how does it feel to be back together after everything that's happened? My microphone picked up the faint crackle of static as I leaned forward. It depends, I said evenly, on what you mean by together. The host blinked, unsure how to respond. My father jumped in quickly, his tone paternal. What Clara means is that we've moved past all that pain. It's behind us now. I turned my head toward him slowly, deliberately. Have we? The audience shifted, sensing the fracture. The host gave a nervous laugh. Seems like there's still a little tension here. There's no tension, my mother said firmly. Only love. That was when I decided to stop pretending. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers didn't shake this time. You said you wanted to talk about truth, I said softly. So let's do that. Clara, my mother, whispered, warning laced in her tone. But I had already connected the phone to the studio sound system. The producer in the booth looked confused, then panicked. I pressed play. My parents' voices filled the speakers, crisp and undeniable. My father's voice first: she'll show up. She wants attention too much not to. Then my mother's: as long as she plays along, we'll be fine. The public loves forgiveness. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The host's mouth fell open. My father's face went white. My mother's hands clenched in her lap. Lauren's eyes widened in horror. I sat there, calm, the recording echoing through the room. That was from 2 nights ago, I said quietly. Their version of redemption. My father lunged toward me, his voice rising. You're out of line. I didn't flinch. You've been out of line my entire life. The audience gasped their shock, morphing into a hunger for truth. The host tried to regain control. Let's all take a breath. But my father's composure had shattered. Do you have any idea what you've done to us? Yes, I said. I told the truth. And it's about time you heard it too. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For once he had none. My mother whispered, "Clara, please." I turned toward her. You wanted forgiveness, but forgiveness only comes after honesty. You can't skip the part where you take responsibility. She looked down, her mascara smudging as tears slipped through. The cameras caught everything. The host, realizing there was no salvaging this, motioned for a commercial break, but the director shook his head. The moment was too raw to cut. Ratings gold. I rose from the couch, microphone still live. I was told no one would notice if I didn't show up. Well, I showed up, and now everyone's listening. The studio audience began to clap, hesitant, unsure whether to celebrate or recoil. I walked off stage before the applause grew. Behind me, chaos erupted, voices shouting, producers scrambling, my father demanding the footage be cut. But it was too late. The internet doesn't wait for permission. By the time I reached the parking lot, the clip was already online. Clara Bennett exposes family on live TV. Within minutes, it spread like wildfire. Ethan called first. "You really did it," he said, voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "I didn't mean to humiliate them," I said softly. "I just couldn't let the lie live any longer." "Clara," he said, "you turned survival into truth. Don't apologize for that." I sat in my car phone, buzzing relentlessly, messages flooding in. Half were praise, half were venom. The world was splitting down the middle again, love or hate, hero or villain. Maybe they were both right. Later that night, I went back to my apartment. My reflection in the dark window looked older somehow. The adrenaline had drained, leaving a quiet ache behind. I poured a glass of wine and turned on the recorder sitting on my desk. The sound of the broadcast played faintly from my phone. In the background, audience gasps, murmured shock, the echo of my own voice, steady and unbroken. I layered it beneath the sound of rain I'd recorded earlier that week. The result was haunting anger and peace, woven together, colliding and dissolving in rhythm. I named the track, "The Truth Broadcast." When I finished, I sat there listening. For the first time, I didn't hear pain in my voice. I heard clarity. The next morning, the clip had over 10 million views. News anchors debated whether I was a whistleblower or a cruel opportunist. Comment sections split between sympathy and outrage. One outlet wrote, "Clara Bennett didn't destroy her family, she exposed them." Another said, "Revenge in real time when justice becomes spectacle." I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I called Lauren. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "They're devastated," she said. "Dad hasn't spoken since the show. Mom's hiding from reporters." "I didn't want it to end like this," I whispered. "But it had to," she said. "You did what they never could, tell the truth." "I didn't win," I said. "Maybe not," she replied. "But you stopped losing." When the call ended, I walked to the window. Seattle's skyline shimmered through the rain, gray and beautiful. I thought about everything that had led me here, the laughter that had mocked me, the silence that had defined me, the truth that had freed me. I turned off my phone and picked up the recorder. They used my silence once, I said quietly. "Now it belongs to me." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft and low. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of the noise, because this time I had made it myself. The following week felt like an earthquake that wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I turned on the television or opened my phone there, I was headlines, interviews, late-night hosts making jokes about the Bennett family meltdown. Some clips froze on my face, mid-sentence. Others slowed down my words as if dissecting a confession. I'd wanted to tell the truth, not become entertainment. But in America, those things were the same. By Wednesday, my publicist, someone I'd hired mostly to filter the noise, called with what she described as an opportunity. "The producers of The Viewpoint want you live," she said. "They're pitching it as your side of the story, your voice against the narrative." "I thought the narrative was mine," I said dryly. "Not anymore," she replied. "Everyone else has one too." I didn't agree right away. I told her I needed a day. Then I walked to the waterfront headphones and pretending to listen to music while my mind played back every word from that studio broadcast. I saw my father's face again, the fury, the disbelief. My mother's silence. Lauren's tears. I wondered if truth had a price or just a receipt you never stopped paying. That night, Ethan called. "You're too quiet," he said. "I'm thinking. About them. About me," I answered. For once. He hesitated. "Then don't let guilt rewrite your story. You didn't destroy them, Clara. They built their lives on a lie, and you stopped helping them maintain it." "I know," I said. "But it doesn't make it easier," he sighed softly. "You never wanted easy. You wanted honest." I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I texted my publicist one word yes. 2 days later, I walked into the studio of The Viewpoint. It was bigger than the last one, slicker, colder cameras that moved like machines with eyes. The host, Diane Carlisle, was known for making people cry on live television. I told myself I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. She started soft, her voice sugar-coated. "Clara, thank you for being here. Millions watched your moment of truth. Some called it brave, others called it cruel. How do you see it?" "I see it as necessary," I said. "Sometimes silence turns toxic. Breaking it is the only cure." Her eyes gleamed. "Do you regret exposing your parents the way you did?" "No," I said evenly. "I regret they made it necessary." The studio was silent except for the faint hum of the lights overhead. She leaned forward. "Do you still love them?" I hesitated. The easy answer was no. But the truth was heavier than that. "Love doesn't disappear," I said finally. "It just changes shape when it's been bruised long enough." The audience didn't clap. They just listened. Diane smiled like she'd found her headline. "And what would you say to your father if he were watching right now?" I looked straight at the camera, seeing his face in the lens. "I'd say I finally became what you said I never could, someone who didn't need your permission to exist." When the interview ended, Diane stood and shook my hand. "You'll never be anonymous again," she said quietly, almost kindly. "Be careful. The world loves a story of pain more than a story of peace." I left without replying. Outside reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing in my face. "Clara, any word from your family? Do you think your father will be arrested? Are you proud of yourself?" I kept walking. Later that night, I went home and shut every device off. The silence was strange, almost suspicious. For the first time in days, I heard nothing but my own breathing. It felt unfamiliar but sacred. Then the knock came. 3 sharp raps. When I opened the door, Lauren stood there, soaked from the rain, eyes rimmed red. "They're charging him, Clara," she said, her voice breaking. "Dad's been indicted. Fraud, tax evasion, everything." For a long moment I couldn't move. "How bad is it?" "Bad," she said. "He's facing years." I stepped aside to let her in. She dropped onto the couch, pulling off her wet coat. "He says it's your fault," she whispered. I sat across from her. "Of course he does. Mom won't talk to anyone. She's hiding in the house. Reporters are everywhere. It's like the whole world is watching us drown." I swallowed hard. "You didn't do this, Lauren. Neither did I." "He did." She looked up, tears streaking her face. "But you lit the match." Her words hit harder than she meant them to. I wanted to argue, to remind her that the fire had already been smoldering before I ever struck back. But instead, I just said quietly, "Maybe someone had to." We sat there in silence for a long time. Eventually, she reached into her purse and handed me an envelope. "He wrote this," she said. "Said it was for you." I didn't want to open it. But when she left, I sat by the window and tore it open anyway. The letter was short, written in the same precise handwriting I'd memorized from childhood birthday cards. "Clara, you've made your point. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth destroying your family's name. Whatever happens next, know this: you are no longer my daughter." Richard, I read it twice, then laughed. It wasn't the hysterical kind, it was the hollow kind that fills the air because nothing else will. Then I picked up my recorder, the one that had started everything. I pressed record and began to read the letter out loud. My voice trembled at first, then steadied. When I finished, I whispered into the mic. "You're right, Dad. I'm not your daughter. I'm my own." I layered his words with mine in post-production later that night, letting his coldness clash with my calm. The track built slowly, his voice breaking apart mine, rising through it like light through smoke. I called it Inheritance. By morning, the piece had gone viral. Not for its scandal, but for its soul. Comments flooded in, people talking about their own parents, their own silence, their own freedom. One wrote, "She turned pain into legacy." Another said, "This is what healing sounds like." When Ethan called, his voice was thick with pride. "You did it again," he said. "You made them listen." "Not to destroy," I said quietly. "To understand." He paused. "So what's next?" I looked around the studio. The wires, the blinking lights, the half-finished sketches taped to the wall. For the first time, it didn't feel like chaos. It felt like home. "I'm going to build something new," I said. "Something that doesn't need a family name to stand." "Then you've already won," he said. After he hung up, I opened the window. The city smelled of rain and renewal. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly like a promise I hadn't believed in for years. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Let them keep the name, I'll keep the truth." The wind carried my words into the gray morning, scattering them like ash, soft, final, free. The day my father was sentenced, the sky over Seattle looked like bruised metal. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones raised, cameras flashing like gunfire. I stood at the edge of the crowd, hidden beneath a dark umbrella, the hood of my coat pulled tight. His name echoed through the air, Richard Bennett, guilty on multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. 15 years. The words sounded both too short and endless. Inside the courtroom was a mosaic of whispers and judgment. My mother sat 2 rows ahead, her pearls absent, her posture crumpled. Lauren was beside her, pale and still. When my father entered, handcuffed but unbroken, the air shifted. He looked older, smaller, like a statue someone had forgotten to polish. Yet when his eyes swept the room and landed on me, the same cold fury flared to life. He didn't speak to me. Not once. Not as the verdict was read, not when the bailiff led him away. But when he passed close enough for me to hear, he muttered, "I hope you're proud." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Pride wasn't the word for what I felt. It wasn't joy or sorrow. It was something deeper, quieter. A release that had waited decades to breathe. When the gavel struck for the final time, I turned and left. The rain had started again, fine and steady. My mother didn't follow. Lauren did. We walked in silence for a few blocks until she finally said, "He'll never forgive you." "I don't need him to," I said. "But you loved him." I did. And that's exactly why I had to stop. She nodded, though her eyes shimmered with tears. "I wish I were as strong as you." I shook my head. Strength isn't what it feels like. It's just what's left when you've lost everything else. That night, I sat by my apartment window watching the city lights blur through the rain. My phone buzzed, nonstop news alerts, statements, requests for comment. Bennett daughter breaks her silence again. The woman who exposed her father. I turned it all off. For the first time in months, I opened the old recordings, the raw ones from before everything had blown up. The sound of laughter at New Year's, the hum of background music, my father's voice telling a joke that made everyone laugh except me. I let it play through the speakers. It didn't hurt anymore. It just sounded old, like a chapter I'd already closed. Ethan called later that evening. "I watched the sentencing," he said. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." "I know, but it had to end somehow." We talked for hours about grief, about healing, about what came next. When I hung up, I realized I hadn't cried once. The tears had already done their work long ago. 2 days later, I visited my mother. The house looked smaller, stripped of its grandeur. Reporters had stopped coming, but the silence they left behind was worse. She opened the door slowly, her face pale and drawn. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I didn't," either I admitted. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The once gleaming photos of awards and magazine covers had been taken down. Only one remained, an old picture of the four of us at the beach. My father's arm around her waist, Lauren laughing, me staring out at the water. She followed my gaze. "He built everything for us," she whispered. "And you tore it down." I turned to her. "He built it on lies, Mom. It was already falling apart. I just stopped pretending it wasn't." She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling. "Do you hate me?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I said quietly. "I just don't believe you anymore." Her eyes filled with tears. "You were always different, Clara. Too loud, too curious, too much." I almost smiled. "You used to say that like it was an insult." She looked down. "I didn't know how to love you the way you needed." I took a slow breath. "Then maybe this is our chance to start over. But only if you can love me for who I am now." She didn't answer. She just nodded faintly, tears spilling down her cheeks. For a moment she looked like someone finally realizing she'd been holding her breath for years. When I left, the air outside felt lighter. Over the next weeks, the world moved on from our story. The headlines shifted to new scandals, new villains. I still received letters, some from strangers, thanking me for speaking up, others accusing me of betraying blood. I stopped reading them. My life had shrunk to something smaller but more real: work, friends, and quiet. One afternoon, Ethan flew in from New York. He met me at the loft with a bottle of champagne and 2 coffee-stained mugs. "To freedom," he said, pouring unevenly. "To survival," I corrected. He smiled. "Same thing, isn't it?" we toasted. The bubbles fizzed between laughter and silence. Then he said, "I talked to Meridian Studios. They want you back for something bigger. Not a documentary, a feature project." "What kind of project?" "Yours," he said. "Full creative control. The story of how truth can rebuild." I hesitated. "You think anyone wants to hear more from me?" He laughed. "Clara, they haven't stopped listening since you opened your mouth." I looked around the studio, my sketches on the wall, wires tangled across the floor, the faint hum of unfinished work. Maybe it was time to use my voice again. That night, I walked along the pier where it all began, the place I'd recorded the first sound of rain after New Year's Eve. The air was cold, sharp with sea salt. I pulled out my recorder and whispered into it. He said no one would notice if I didn't show up. But they did. And not because I was perfect, because I refused to stay silent. The waves crashed softly against the dock. I hit play, layering the sound with the recording of my father's verdict. His name, his sentence, the gavel's echo. Then I added the sound of rain, blending past and present until they were one. When I played it back, it didn't sound like vengeance anymore. It sounded like closure. A few days later, I uploaded the track to the Horizon Studio website under a simple title, The Sound of After. Within hours, messages poured in from strangers across the world, people who had walked away from their own families, their own silence. Some wrote paragraphs, others only one line: "You made me brave." For the first time, I realized my voice didn't just belong to me anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been erased. That night, as I stood by the window of my loft, I could see the reflection of the city glittering below, alive and unapologetic. My phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. "Mom's listening to your new piece," she cried. She said it sounds like forgiveness. I stared at the text for a long time before replying, "Maybe it is." Outside, the rain began again, steady and familiar. The sound no longer hurt. It simply reminded me I was still here, still moving, still heard. And this time, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peace. New Year's Eve came around again, 1 year to the day, since I'd been told I was just an extra. The city outside my window pulsed with gold and silver lights, laughter echoing up from the street below. Somewhere out there, people were counting down, kissing, promising to change. I sat at my desk in the loft, surrounded by cables, empty mugs, and a faint hum from the speakers that had become the heartbeat of my life. It didn't feel like an ending anymore. It felt like a beginning I'd earned. A soft knock came at the door. When I opened it, Lauren stood there holding a small bottle of champagne. Her smile was uncertain but real. "I thought maybe you shouldn't be alone tonight," she said. I stepped aside to let her in. "You always had good timing." We sat on the couch, the same couch that had seen me fall apart and rebuild, the same one I'd slept on when Horizon Studio was just a dream and a space heater. She poured the champagne into mismatched glasses, and for a while we said nothing. The fireworks outside began, early faint pops echoing through the sky. She was the first to speak. "Mom wanted to come," she said softly, "but she thought it would be too much." "It's okay," I said. "She's here in her own way." Lauren nodded, taking a sip. "She listens to your recordings now. Every night. Says they make her feel like you're talking to her." "That's funny," I said, smiling faintly. "Half of them were about her." "She knows," Lauren replied. "She's different, Clara. I think losing everything made her see how much she already had." I looked out the window at the city lights. "And you?" "I'm trying," she said. "I'm doing local broadcasts again, no scripts, no pretending. Just people's stories." I guess we both found our voices in different ways. Something in her tone made my chest ache with pride. "I'm glad," I said quietly. "You sound happy." "I am," she said, and after a pause, "Are you?" The question lingered between us, heavier than the silence that followed. I set my glass down and thought about the past year, the courtrooms, the cameras, the nights I'd cried until dawn, the mornings I'd woken up and chosen to keep going. I thought about Ethan's steady voice, the sound of rain recorded through open windows, the faces of strangers who had written to say my story gave them courage. "I think I am," I said finally. "Not because everything's fixed, but because I stopped needing it to be." Lauren smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "You did it, you know. You changed everything." I shook my head. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes that's the biggest change of all," she said. When midnight approached, we moved to the balcony. The air was cold, sharp, with the scent of snow and fireworks. The countdown began in the streets below 10:98, and the sky exploded in color. I felt the vibration through the rail, through my bones, through everything that had once been broken. When the last echo faded, I turned to her. "You know what's strange? I used to think revenge would feel like victory, but it feels more like relief." Lauren nodded slowly. "Maybe that's all it was ever supposed to be." We stood there a while longer, watching the lights die down. Then she hugged me tight, her voice small against my shoulder. "I'm proud of you." After she left, I went back inside and sat at my desk. The recorder waited beside the keyboard. I pressed the red button, the familiar click filling the room. "My name is Clara Bennett," I began, my voice steady. "A year ago tonight I was told I didn't matter, that I was just an extra. But sometimes the extra is the one who keeps the story honest. Sometimes the one left out becomes the reason the story changes." I paused, listening to the hum of the city outside, the distant fireworks, echoing like fading applause. "This year," I continued, "I learned that revenge isn't destruction, it's reclamation. It's taking back the parts of yourself they said weren't worth loving. It's realizing that being cut out of their story doesn't mean you stop writing your own." I exhaled slowly, letting the silence fill the room. It wasn't the kind of silence that suffocates anymore. It was the kind that listens. A soft ping from my phone broke the quiet. It was an email from an address I hadn't seen in months. From Ethan Caldwell. Subject: "Let's build something new." I opened it. "I've been offered a partnership for a new project in New York, a platform for independent sound artists. I want Horizon to be part of it. Think bigger. Think louder. I smiled, the kind that reached all the way to the bones. I typed back 2 words, absolutely in. Outside, another firework burst across the sky, its reflection dancing across the window. I looked at it for a long moment before whispering into the recorder. The silence ended the day I stopped waiting for permission to be heard. Then I hit stop. Weeks later, the new project launched. Horizon Studio partnered with Ethan's firm to create Frequency Collective, a space where artists could tell stories through sound. We held workshops, built installations, collaborated with schools. I watched young designers record the creak of doors, the hush of wind, the laughter of strangers turning small sounds into symphonies. I saw myself in all of them, hungry, hopeful, healing. During the opening event, someone approached me, a young woman clutching her phone. "Your story saved me," she said. "I left home last year after hearing you speak. I thought I'd disappear, but I didn't. I started recording the world, and now I'm studying sound engineering." I hugged her. "You didn't disappear," I whispered. "You amplified." Later that night, I stood by the window of the new studio looking out over Manhattan's skyline. The city buzzed beneath me, alive and restless, but my heart was calm. The weight I'd carried for years was finally gone. My phone buzzed again. A message from Mom. "I listened to your new piece. It made me cry. I'm sorry for everything." For a moment my eyes blurred. Then I typed back, "I forgive you. Be well." I didn't need her approval anymore, but forgiveness still mattered for me for what came next. When I left the studio that night, the streets glistened under the city lights, and snow began to fall, soft, quiet, endless. I walked through it without hurrying. The world didn't feel cold. It felt new. At the corner I stopped and looked up at the sky. Somewhere far above the noise, fireworks flared again, delayed bursts from another part of the city. I smiled and whispered to myself, "They said no one would notice if I didn't show up, but I did, and now they'll never forget it." As I walked on, my footsteps mixed with the sounds of laughter, music, and celebration, and for the first time in my life I wasn't part of someone else's story. I was the story. To those listening now, if you've ever been erased, underestimated, or told you don't belong, remember this. The silence only wins if you stay quiet. Tell your truth. Take up space. And when they try to turn off your mic, build your own stage. If my story found you tonight, let me know where you're listening from. And if you believe that no voice should ever be silenced again like this video, share it and subscribe. Because every echo, no matter how small, deserves to be heard.